I try. All right, everyone ready? Ready? Yeah! Woo! All right, there we go. I'll get my Red Bull. So this is Wacky and Wild Security, getting things under CIS control. Jeremio, I'll go into more of my background. How many people are familiar with the CIS controls, critical controls stuff? How many aren't familiar with it? It's okay. Raise your hands. I want to teach you something. All right. Oh. Uh-oh. Apparently lag and delay. There we go. Okay. So, Jeremio, I'm an information security officer within local government. Specifically, I do work for Cuyahoga County. I also run and manage a few companies locally as well, specialize in security convergence between physical and cyber. And I have a lot more. I'm also a weapons instructor, so I do a lot of stuff between both physical and cyber security. Just as a disclaimer, as always, yeah, thanks. There you go. Thanks, Justin. Come over here. So, I do not represent CIS or any affiliate. So everything I go through here, they are CIS Controls, but I don't really represent them. I do, ironically, co-chair on one of the MSI SAC, which is a CIS subsidiary for their business resiliency. But again, I do not represent CIS for the CIS Controls at all. But to go in, so how many people, before I go to that slide, are familiar with the CIS, that are familiar with the CIS Controls, are actually familiar about the history? Well, trivia here. Who's very familiar with the CIS Controls? Kind of. Hey, where did they come from? You guys really know? The internets? The interwebs? The Googles? So, look at that. He gets a cookie. So, in 2008, the Secretary of Defense asked the NSA for help prioritizing specifics like through attack vectors of like what controls they need to standardize on as a more so federal government, and essentially they said, well, the military can't keep us protected of cyber threats, so we need to figure this out, right? In 2008 really isn't that long ago for the government or anyone really to do this, right? It's really interesting. So again, the NSA agreed to participate in the public-private consortium. Again, it was led by SANS and CIS to share attack information and build controls off of. There were a lot of other people in that consortium. There were industry leaders. There were work groups. There were DHS was in there. There's a lot of people in that, but those were the main kind of leaders that kind of got a lot of those individuals together and round tables to create some of the controls. Again, 2009, the CIS controls were circulated. The first big use case, at least from the government standpoint, was the State Department, which apparently, and I tried to look into this a lot because it's pretty interesting, they claim an 88% risk reduction in obviously reported security vulnerabilities and instances. But they did, that is a metrics that is published. So they had that after just focusing their current security program in just the areas of the critical controls. So it's pretty interesting. I think it's a really large number. Probably most likely not accurate, but again, I don't speak on that. But it is interesting statistics. 2011, this was a pretty big deal for the CIS controls. The UK essentially also adopted the CIS controls as a government standpoint, which is pretty big because it's a foreign government now also standardizing some of the CIS controls. And then, I don't know if you guys know, just as a sub note, another large control framework that's used a lot is the Australian Defense. They have their own, which are hand in hand, a lot of the CIS controls as well. I think they're the top 25 mitigated controls. So CIS Controls, if you haven't seen them before, you've probably seen a poster like this, just one of the SANS posters or wherever. Used to be called the Critical Security Controls, now the CIS Controls. It's a bench, kind of a branding thing. But again, you've seen these heat maps, all the, solution partners, like, you got Splunk, you got Rapid7, and apparently these green things are supposed to tell you, like, how good they are, So does that give you a good picture of, like, what to buy there with this, like, green heat map? I don't know. It's interesting to look at. So now the CIS Controls, version 7, it came out recently, probably within the past, probably 3 or 4 months. Really say basically the same stuff. What they've done, they focus on is organizing a lot of things, especially for small companies. A lot of this stuff is really for, your smaller companies to be able to use a control framework without really being able to understand a lot of the really, really complex frameworks. How many people know the framework their company like aligns to? Or at least if it's multiple, at least you know it's multiple. How many? How many don't know they align to? There we go. That's scary. Anyway, with aligning to those, if you do know what you align to and you align to, has anyone ever been through an actual full NIST or ISO or COBIT like audit and mapped every control you have in your entire security program to like each one of those mappings? Kind of. The author back there has apparently done all these things. Anyways, they broken these up into the basic foundation organization. Really, they broke them up in like the first 6, the next 16, and then like the last 4 or whatever. But it does help out. You'd be surprised at what just doing this, like putting lines and then like doing different coloring, it really helps a lot of smaller organizations. A lot of these organizations are like law firms or small public entities. So I work within like local government. A lot of cities and local governments, they really don't have the resources that, to actually map to a full NIST framework. Now, state governments are mandated to, and they still have troubles, and they have a lot of resources. So what do you do with that, right? And how do you map? So, for instance, the first control, as a lot of you might know, is inventory. That's actually a pretty hard thing to do. And how do you do that? Well, I don't know. It just tells me to. And then I can inventory all software assets. It's like, if you're a small company, yeah, maybe you could do that. But can you really do that if you're one of the like, kind of like going from the going small to mid size? Like, how do you do that? How do you map? What controls do you really map to? Right? So, again, I kind of touched on some of these. A lot of the controls are actually mapped through threat vectors, through new attack vectors and things. They actually do try to get these, and some would say, like, well, why is inventory of assets, how is that tied to a threat vector, and why does it need to be changed? Well, there are actually a lot of subcontrols under each one of these. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the CIS controls. They might not be familiar with all the subcontrols underneath that, and that's what we'll kind of go through, an example of that. Again, so they try to address a new landscape, focus on key topics, again, authentication and all the encryptions, app whitelisting as always. What that means is they've always focused on that, but they're trying to focus it more on practical. So like I know specifically app whitelisting, some places it's just not realistic. What are the subcontrols that can you go through to actually get a more realistic outcome than just trying to do full application whitelisting on everything, right? The other thing is better aligned with other frameworks. Again, a lot of CIS controls, a lot of places I know we use them for, and others use them as a baseline framework to then map to a larger framework. Some baseline to get you there, to then maybe after you get through a CIS controls assessment with all the subcontrols, you can actually start to map to something like NIST or ISO or COBIT. If that's where you want to go. Again, for the auditors, right? That makes them happy. It also makes the executives happy. At the end of the day, a lot of this stuff might be fluff, and you might be like, well, I already know all these controls. I know all the technical stuff that aligns to these. I'm a super, ninja cyber expert, and we're good. We need to do these things. I know it because I know it. Well, that's not good enough for some of the executives. And if you can say you map whatever fancy thing you want to do or you think's really important. If you want multi-factor authentication on for the whole environment and you want that, maybe you can start with an actual business case or really use case where you can map it to the framework and map it to a specific business requirement within your values and core values. And that might just all of a sudden, turn on a light with your executives more than, I want everybody to carry a phone around and log in 8 different times to our app, right? So, and then the other thing that they really worked on is improving the consistency and wording of each subcontrol. A lot of subcontrols were just a lot of stuff. It was a lot to take in. They've really tried to focus those subcontrols on actionable items that you can actually do. Instead of having like 6 different things within that subcontrol to do. I know that one company specifically that writes actually a really good mapping of the CIS controls to like actual technical controls is Alien Vault. They actually have an entire like blog like towards this stuff, and it's just a lot of things to do. They also made again structural changes and some again they get feedback. If you guys are really passionate about security, you can get really involved here. The CIS also has, if you guys are familiar with the CIS benchmarks, they have a work group. You can apply to be on that work group and be on their monthly calls, or you can tweet at them. You could do a lot of things where you can be involved instead of attacking them and being like, why is this a benchmark? This is stupid. They have this switch on in Microsoft Active Directory. You guys don't know what you're doing. Well, they have a lot of stuff. They do a lot of things. So if you help that and be more productive with that, the whole community can kind of eventually get all those outcomes and really be together. Because like I've seen Twitter wars go back. How many people have seen the Twitter wars go back and forth of people arguing back and forth and really I don't want to say attacking these companies, but really it's we're all trying to help out. The thing about the CIS, if you get to the CIS controls and you help out, that stuff goes out broader than the entire United States. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there, so you can help out. You can always get in touch with them and stuff like that. So, anyways, it's a big deal for me because I know local government. We try to get the community help in a lot of things, and people complain, and there's a lot of even just the local level. But if you don't come out and go to those meetings and they're publicly available and things, the CIS is publicly available there for everybody. So that's just my little rant on that. So, CIS controls, how can we use them, right? I don't always use an actual framework, but when I do, you can do them easy with the CIS controls, right? So, how many knowing the CIS controls have actually implemented specifically in alignment with CIS controls? Like, I know I inventory assets because I have, some type of inventory system, SCCM or whatever. How many people have actually know that their company's written it out like that? Anyone? Kind of? Oh, I got some gold stars up here. So, again, are you fully aligned to these? I asked that earlier. If not, you should probably start somewhere. And where do you start? It's somewhere to start. There's a lot of documentation. People think that even if they know the CIS controls, they have to go and create all this documentation. There's a lot of stuff available just right here. So, like, take a breath, relax a little, just try to organize some stuff. I've been in some really wacky and wild security places. I do work within local government, for not even from a local government perspective, seeing other local governments, other cities, and then in my other company side, going from just really small law firms to really large places that offer services that you really think would have their stuff together, but they really might not. So just literally, I tell some people, like, just list everything you have. How many of you have like 9 different, maybe not 9, but how many of you have like 4 or 5 different network monitoring tools? Like the engineers use one, DevOps uses one, security has its own, and you got, some go to the SIM, some go to the configuration manager, some go left and right, some go to the, the 24/7 help desk, some go here. Just listing all your stuff out. I know that seems really very, very basic, but not knowing everything you have, especially just in a security environment, or what you have, I mean, it goes a long way just to start. This is coming from like nothing, and going towards something. So while you're still breathing there, refine the list. There's really no wrong or right way. I misspelled right, so I'm a security guy, cyber, computer science. Anyways, list the main controls, and then create a matrix, right? Ignore all the subcontrols, create a matrix, get all the, 1 through 20 controls, start mapping them out, and just checkbox literally the capabilities of every system and process, and even include your process. There's a lot of people who don't include your processes, from disaster recovery, to incident response, to malware analysis, and go through everything and then adjust it for each control slightly. And then start adding weights. For instance, your Active Directory system and SCCM probably monitors and inventories probably all your Windows assets, right? That makes sense. They can monitor and collect on Linux assets as well, but maybe you have a separate configuration system. Maybe you have, like a Ubuntu landscape or some other type of chef or puppet thing that actually controls, some of the Linux infrastructure, or maybe you have a whole complete separate inventory system that does that stuff. We'll try to weigh that out, and what you can do is, again, create your own heat map. So you see the heat map of all the vendors. Create your own heat map. I kind of have that here. It's blurry on purpose there. But you start kind of going. You think it's going to look this fancy, but then it probably doesn't. It looks like more something like this. Again, this is like just an Excel of all the stuff, and then going through, from the top, kind of focusing on the 5 controls, going all the way out, and then weighing down, and being really not too concerned with specific metrics or weights or percentages or whatever. And then you can kind of focus on, like, just generally, where do you have just more things doing other things, right? I got a bunch of stuff doing, I got 23 systems for this specific use case, 23 systems that are doing inventory in some form or fashion with the weights, right? You'd be surprised how many things could be used as inventory. For instance, I've seen some places that use their vulnerability management as their inventory system, because guess what? It scans everything. And it scans more stuff, the IoT stuff. How do you inventory all your IoT stuff? Do you have an IoT inventory system? Probably not. But somewhere, maybe you have an IPAM, maybe you have an IP access management. Maybe that at least inventories it in a way as a static IP, at least know who the owner is, and it's somewhat either manually or passively scanning that asset for an inventory. Well, it's not tied into SCCM. I mean, do you have all the hooks everywhere and it all goes to your CMDB and it's like perfect utopian magical unicorn? No, it's probably not. But you do have to work through and know all those. Maybe all the IoT stuff is specifically in your IP access manager, and maybe all your Windows assets are there or in SCCM. And maybe all your Linux stuff is in your whatever Linux configuration management system you use. And then maybe you have one-off stuff and they're all in a specific place, but you need that really to understand where that is, especially in a, I would say, small to mid-tier environment where you're on the cusp, where you have more assets than you really think you have, but you still are flexible enough to know them all, right? So, is anyone feeling me here? Feeling me? All right. So again, going down to the subcontrols and the real metrics. Here's an example of just one of the subcontrol 1, how detailed this does get. Semi-detailed. So you got utilizing Active Directory Discovery Tool. Again, that could be SCCM, that could be some type of AD tool, that could be some fancy product you paid a lot of money for that does this stuff too. Again, you could do a passive asset discovery tool. Again, not active, but still at least some type of baseline of a point in time where you had stuff on your network. I've given other talks before of like using essentially just nmap and then doing an ndiff and doing that nightly. Some places do that. That's better than nothing. You're doing a cron job where you're just doing an ndiff nightly, and what changed in your environment at least daily. That's better than some people can say. And that's covering everything. That's everything that's at least IP, available wherever you're scanning at, that's accessible with the basic scanning utilities you have. Again, DHCP. How many people do DHCP logging? Okay, all right, that's good. Got 3 hands there, right? So again, very useful. Very useful to update asset inventory. Again, you're getting a lot more information using the DHCP, and you can kind of merge those with some of your other log information. It helps a lot correlating. Again, kind of go to that then forth. This is kind of like going up the maturity model here. Maintaining the detailed asset inventory. Again, very self-explanatory there. And then the other thing is, okay, you find some other things that aren't inventory or network. Say like 200 machines show up in your NDIF, and you're like, whoa, what happened there? Do you actually address it, or do you just say like, oh, that's weird? How many have actually addressed an unauthorized asset on their network? That I don't know if I have interaction with the audience. I got one hand, but so I know we've gone through some of that stuff. I've been a place where they were in like a shared data center, and all of a sudden they like an entire company spun up, and the data center company or the hosting environment didn't have the circuits right, and they actually had a subnet into the other thing. All of a sudden, like 200 assets showed up overnight. How many places probably wouldn't notice that potentially? And it wasn't joined to their domain, so it wasn't going to be in their SCCM. It wasn't actually really going to do network traffic because it was going through another circuit, but it did show up on a random subnet just because they were scanning the whole, /16 or whatever. That's not a malicious actor. That's just a mistake on a hosting side on a data center. That stuff can happen. And, an NDIF, that cron job is what caught it out of all the fancy $100,000 technology. So anyways, just to kind of go through some of that stuff. And then obviously deploying port level access control, and then getting really fancy with client-side certificates for hardware assets, either through your PKI or something like that, and really diligently actually enforcing that. So any questions? Any people go through these subcontrols or have used these subcontrols or find these subcontrols helpful? Again, even if you're doing a lot of this stuff, and a lot of people are doing a lot within this space, if you map something, so say you've wanted to do DHCP logging like forever, and you've always told your executives it was important to do, put the resources to, you can actually, using something like a controls framework that actually says DHCP logging, and it's saying, well, we need to tie to 1.3 of the first subcontrol in the CIS because that's where we map to an executive. And it was like, this is important because the top 4 are very, are the most important critical controls or control frameworks that you can complete. And they say, oh, well, maybe we should put some resources to that. It sounds kind of important. Or maybe if you do enough of those and there's a product that you want and you've done an actually full assessment of that product, and it ties to 4 of these and 3 of the maybe control 2, then control 3 and 4, and maybe some other controls, you can have a lot better business case to buy that $200,000 fancy blinky box that would actually help you do a lot more than before. You'd be surprised at how far mapping your tools to controls and then presenting them to the executive level go than just trying to say, we need DLP because DLP is super important, right? So again, so I'm going to go a little more in detail here. So just 1.1, they go more detailed than just even that. Each subcontrol then has an actual criteria that you can actually measure against. Again, these are just generic summary measurements. But for instance, this is the Active Directory discovery tool. Again, what percentage of organizations, networks have not been recently scanned by that tool, right? So you could say, well, this tool scans this percentage or whatever. They actually have sigma level percentages that are actually weighted to be able to say if it's a level 1 through a level 6. And that's stuff that can get translated to the business a lot better than we need Active Directory discovery tools because, the cybers are out there to attack our networks, and we need all these computers, and the flux capacitor to report back and tell us what's bad and good, right? So this helps a lot better, and it actually has statistical values based on a framework that businesses are familiar with. So that's the important part there. So for instance, I have an example of an assessment I did, and what actually showed that a lot of people, if you would have just asked them, like, what's the top 4 controls that you know that you're the weakest in? Based on not only based on a controls assessment, but also of your business and how it operates. For instance, control 15, you might not have any wireless access control, but you might not have wireless access points. I don't know, right? Or the only wireless access points you might have are all public anyway. Well, do you need controls or not? So I know for this one, I did, this was a level 1, so that means more than 69% didn't have any wireless access control. It's a pretty big deal. That was the number 1 threat vector, more than the phishing protection they had, because they actually had an awareness program in place, and they had, a lot of email mitigation and things like that. It was actually, but their wireless access control was a 4-digit password that never changed for 4 or 5 years, right? So you might not come to your head right away, or even the CISO or manager's mind right away until they do just this basic controls assessment. Again, disaster recovery, and then just going through this, and then some people will say, like, well, control use of admin. Well, like, why is that not, like, that's a big deal. Why is that not up there? Well, for this specific assessment, it was a level 3, meaning that, less than, I can't remember the percentages, 6.9% of people had, no controls within admin rights, but, those specific people were also, like, kiosk control, like, people, like, it was very, very low control for whatever reason they didn't have that. Still a high risk, but a low enough level where it's still on the list of things to be addressed, but not something that maybe needs to be addressed higher than the wireless access control. So, does that kind of make sense? I mean, I know this might be pretty basic to some, but again, if you can translate it to the business and actually communicate the high level, and actually when your executive comes down and asks either your boss or yourself, what's our biggest concerns? You can't just say, well, everyone has admin access, so, everything's screwed. Like, well, you could say that, but that's not, or you could be like, well, the wireless access control, because of this, and that, and we need to have, we have specific weights and measures, and we did, like, somewhat of a logical assessment on all of our stuff, and this is why we need to focus our direction here or there, or we can push this down. Maybe AppSec software isn't really that big of a deal because we only have 2 custom software applications that are very, very mostly vendor controlled, and we've already assessed that vendor, and we only do a custom module within there. So it's definitely something we need to be concerned about, but it's not super high on the list. We don't need dynamic and static analysis, software, and spend a bunch of money on it, even though it might be cool to do, right? Those are the type of things that you can look at. I kind of ran through this, so I'm going to kind of stop for questions here. No questions? Any concerns? Well, I mean, that's pretty much. I try to keep my slides pretty limited here, and I try to get breaks in between talks because people need beer. So, what? Any feedback on that? You guys gonna use the control framework?
It's a good place to start. One, then you knock that out of the park, then you go to number 2, and you go to number 1 control, and then.
So a lot of people, because at least 1 through I would say 5, some people would argue 6, are all connected, in a sense. So if you go back to like some of the basics ones, I know you probably can't read it from there, but again, really the first 2 are just all about inventory. So I mean, definitely start there. It's number 1. If you don't know what's on your systems, I'm not even talking about on just anything on there, to even like understand what you need the rest of your things to align to. That's number one. A lot of people maybe will get to like an 80 or 90% there, and then they'll just move on to the next one. And then as you keep going and you build and you start going into like over here wireless access control, and you start going to like really, really like specific limitations and controls, you really start limiting yourself, and you start getting like the chicken and the egg, because you start trying to do like PKI, but then like all of a sudden you turn it on and you do certificate-based authentication, and all of a sudden like 10% of your net like users can't connect because you weren't correctly deploying the certificates to them because you didn't know, for whatever reason, there was an ACL and they weren't getting certain updates. So really focusing on the first two, and then really going from there is, I would argue that control use of admin privilege is probably a little bit above vulnerability assessment, but you could connect those two. Is again not only removing administrative privileges, but creating the processes in place for both your IT and business to function without the use of admin controls is a lot more important than you start ripping out admin controls. Because you'd be surprised what legacy apps are there that require admin roles, which really don't. They just require you to have administrative privileges over that specific like directory, which you can customize in and still remove admin rules. So that's another like place to really be cautious of before you start ripping it out. Or if you're starting scratch, I mean, you could start, and it's a new company and all this stuff. I mean, you just start from the beginning with that. But really understanding that, and then log analysis and secure configuration. So you're just hardening things, right? Having standard golden images, hardening things, and then monitoring and maintenance and analysis of logs. Really just an entire company could spend years just right there at those. A lot of these other things just start coming in like, kind of like just entwined with these, like data protection will probably get pushed into like some of these secure configurations and logging and some other stuff. Account monitoring control, again, going to be pushed into your logging and stuff. A lot of this stuff, pieces and parts of these start to be complete as you really start to complete the basic controls. You'd be surprised at how much of once you do the first, 6 controls, and then you start going through the rest of them, and a lot of this stuff is kind of just there, or maybe just historically there. Like a lot of people at least know security awareness is important. Like, are they getting metrics of that? Or are they just doing it, right? So I hope that answers kind of your question there. Ooh. So, her question was, what is in government, in my personal opinion, what is the most least implemented control? Very interesting. Let me pick. I can just go like this. Just kidding. Probably, honestly, application software security, probably, just because the amount of custom programs in government space and just the public sector space, and then just that being I wouldn't say newer topic in security, but just one that was always kind of neglected, or if it was being done, it was being done in like its own kind of thing, its own little vacuum. The other thing that I would probably put on that as well is awareness, security awareness. It's probably just not being done. A lot of the places do it. It's leave it and forget it, and they just go through a couple videos, and that's not real security awareness training. That's the number one things I think, especially public sector and government need. And then you could get, obviously there aren't many red team unless you go in the federal government, so I wouldn't even include that as a thing, but probably the organizational whole thing over here, this whole square probably, is probably the lower maturity model. The interesting thing about government organizations is that they do publish their maturity models publicly based on the control framework. So you could actually look up your specific state's overall posture and things like that if they completed it. So it's pretty interesting. Other questions?
Training and whatnot. We know that the easiest way to hack companies is social, right?
Yeah.
So how do you balance its priority with the others? For more technical quality.
Mhm.
How do you balance the people in the process with the rest of the folks?
So the question was, because the number one vector industry-wide into an organization is through social engineering, and with 17 being implementing a security awareness training, how do you connect the people, process, and tools together in a way that's different than all these technical controls that exist here? So it's a little more difficult, and I know that the CIS actually does go back and forth between having processy kind of base security things with the technical stuff, but they kept these in over here because all of these really are kind of more process oriented. So they're kind of labeled as organizationally. But they do intertwine into a lot of this. And so it goes back and forth, but their actual metrics and stuff they have in here. And they actually go into more in depth than some of these that are a little more difficult and higher level than others. And just because this is 17 doesn't mean this is the 17th most important thing. So that's why they used to have them in this kind of like thing where they had them, they had them in this like kind of thing right here where they had them numbered. And that's why they've kind of, I think, this is just my opinion, they try to really kind of get these up and more like this is basic foundational organizationally, and then they're just kind of like all labeled down like this. So organizationally, this is number one. And in their like whole description and of the CIS controls, they get into that. So these are not, just because 1 and 4 are like the ones that are always connected to, all these they're really in no specific order. It doesn't mean that after this you just go to email and you go to malware defenses and you go so it's really somewhat confusing, but they have to, I feel like, number them just to have numbers, and we're humans and we like structure. But they try to put it like this, so it shows in it. Because if this was labeled out and this wasn't in like all its colors, you probably wouldn't even see number 17 as security awareness, because it would have just been, you would have looked at the first 5 and maybe the last one, and then like it just all kind of gets. So it's like, and their whole thing isn't to label this as the 17th or those are the top 4. It's to make everyone aware of like whatever controls they need to. So they're just trying to offer this. They do this like almost as a non-profit towards companies. So like they need feedback like that, and they get it. So.
That's good. That's what I spent a lot of time in the PCI world. Like in the PCI prioritized approach. Everybody's really people level, nail level 1 first. According to that, that's just for PCI, which frankly doesn't care about availability of data.
Right.
It's confidential. So whatever. It's totally from a holistic perspective. But yeah, they say 17. A lot of aspects of 17 would be like level 1.
Right.
And a lot of your basics would also be level 1. But it's,
It goes, yeah. So he commented more on PCI and how PCI is a specific framework of importance of certain controls, mostly around confidentiality, and that is true. The good thing about when you really look into the resources of CIS and the controls, they do map to so not only ISO, NIST, or COBIT, but they go to PCI, to HIPAA, to, any control framework that you could really imagine, they map to. And if they don't, literally an email or a tweet at them will probably get them working on that and map it. They have people there to do that, not only for you, but for the whole community. So you can use these resources a lot more than you might think. You might not think, I could just email CIS and get a feedback request and get them working on something, but that actually happens. I've seen it happen via Twitter. So. Any other questions? I'm gonna go back to my slides, and then I really was kind of done. So that's why I stopped for questions there. I wanted to keep you on the edge, though. So yeah, the CIS controls, you can go. It's literally cis.org/controls. The other thing that I want to really point out, though, is that they go really, really in depth of specific controls. So for instance, understanding CIS control number 5, so that's admin privileges. They go through an entire whole page, and then they have multiple resources of how to implement and how to safely implement from a business perspective admin privileges, and they have a lot of stuff there for use that a lot of people might not ever really read. So it's very useful information. So that's all I have. Thank you.